World War III update. So I'm going to attempt to try to help you make sense of these peace negotiations that we're hearing about today. It's always important, if you want to understand what's going on in the fog of war, to zoom out, to look at the big picture, and also look at timing. If Russia wins this war, if the dividing lines were drawn tomorrow and Russia was able to retain the amount of land that it currently occupies with little to no reprisal, then what would happen is that would put most of the immense amount of resource wealth in the hands of the former Soviet Union. And of course, this would leave Europe out to dry. Europe stands to benefit by having a perpetual scapegoat, an enemy, in order to have a rally around the flag patriotic invocation as they endure through the austere times that await as people divest away from the euro. And Europe, who has developed and is basically dependent on a service-based economy, lacks the vital resources in order to continue to grow its economy, never mind its military industry. Now, all roads lead to China in the end. And if Russia is allowed to win, you're going to see China on steroids. So this is why they need to maintain the pressure. We also need to think about the Monroe Doctrine play that is currently at work in South America, where the United States is positioning itself to essentially oust any kind of Russian and Chinese influence within that region in preparation for World War III. So a lot of this peace talk is really just a smokescreen to take attention away from what's about to go down in Venezuela, and also an attempt to get NATO involved in the Ukraine war. That's the main thrust of this whole thing, is to create a certain set of conditions that they know that the Russians are going to have to reject, which is the amended and the augmented, from the Ukrainian point of views, new peace plan, which has been reduced down to 19. I mean, does it really matter at this point? Because nobody really knows what the actual plan is until it comes out. Regardless, this 28-point plan apparently was leaked by the Russians or the Americans. The Russians deny leaking this at all, and I can say that it would be very unlikely that this was a Russian devised plan, because there's many things inside the plan that the Russians wouldn't agree with. And it's basically a way that the NATO forces can enter into Ukraine because the front lines are collapsing and they need Article 5-like guarantees. They need to salvage what remains of Ukraine, and that, of course, means bringing us to the brink of thermonuclear war. Now, all of this aside, if the war was to end tomorrow, that is when the real Cold War begins. Okay, that is when things get really deadly serious. And right as it seems that things are about to dial down in Russia, which, as we're going to talk about in a moment, they most certainly aren't, things are ratcheting up in the Pacific, where you now have Japan getting ready to put weapon systems around the island chains. In Taiwan, you have Taiwan committing to another $40 billion in U.S. weapons purchases, okay? So things are starting to heat up in that neck of the woods. And what happens with this global conflict, this world war that is ensuing, when one conflict gets suppressed, that pressure that gets pent up has to be released somewhere. So it's going to manifest in some other theater of conflict if, and that is a very big if, we're able to achieve some sort of a temporary reprieve in hostilities. Now, last night, Russia, according to Ukraine, lost a A-50 airborne early warning and control aircraft, although some people are saying it's actually a Beriev A-60 airborne laser aircraft. Either way, these are both very expensive aircrafts which have a strategic utility. The former more so than the latter. The airborne laser aircraft is experimental, whereas the A-50, if they actually did target an A-50, this is a continuing incremental chipping away at Russia's nuclear strategic capabilities, which of course is a sign that this situation is really still escalating far beyond what they're painting in the mainstream media. Now, in order to understand the specifics of what is really going on, because we're never going to get, they're never going to spell this out to you. You have to decipher it on your own. And you do that by looking at how is the media responding to all of this stuff. Okay, it looks like I double printed my notes here. I want to show you 3 stories from Russia Today, which kind of summarize the tone in the Russian media anyway. So this is one. Moscow decries megaphone diplomacy as Kiev claims Zelensky ready to make deal with Trump. Okay, so Moscow is denying that they've been briefed about any of this that's been going on so far. Now, the Russians are maintaining plausible deniability, but if there was merit to this proposal, I would presume that in the typical fashion, the Russians would be more available and more eager to engage and dignify this proposal openly and publicly. And of course, Russia Today won't say anything that hasn't been approved by the Kremlin. There's a bit of wiggle room, but really not that much at the end of the day. This is another, and that I should say, blurry, and that I should say is another, this was a red line story. This was a red banner story on Russia Today, which means they wanted everybody to take note of that, okay? Fyodor Lukyanov says, this is another front page story from Russia Today, peace will only come when Kiev accepts the reality, which shows you that these slight differences that Trump is saying that the Ukrainians and the Russians have, we got to quit saying that because it's the United States and the Russians who are at war. The Ukrainians are merely a battering ram, a proxy for NATO, okay? So that tells you that how far apart that these little sticking points are a lot bigger, and we're going to talk about the specifics of that in just a moment. And lastly, a Russian negotiator, and this was breaking news, this was another red banner story. You only get the red banner story on Russia Today if it's top down, okay? Russian negotiator on Ukraine denies phone call leak. Kirill Dmitriev has said that the transcript of his supposed conversation published by the U.S. media is false. So what happened was Bloomberg published an article that claimed that Kirill and Putin were discussing how they could surreptitiously inject this 28-day proposal into the discourse, implying that it was in fact authored by the Russians, like a lot of the Western media is saying. And the Russians are saying vehemently that they did not have anything to do with this proposal's creation. Now, of course, there are probably points of agreement within the proposal that one could say Russia would agree with, but certainly not all of them, okay? Now, it's in the Russian interest, it's in all parties' interests to continue to temporize the situation just a little bit longer. Because so long as they can do that, they can buy themselves more time. And nobody wants to have to make the fateful decisions that might arise from a direct, open confrontation between NATO and Russia. Now, here's the problem with the way that both the Russians and the Americans are engaged in negotiations at this point in time. It's incredibly passive-aggressive. And so long as the Americans pretend as though it's the Ukrainians who are fighting with the Russians, and they aren't at the behest of their primary benefactor, which is the United States, and of course Europe, which is a close second, so long as they pretend that it's not them and their interests who are at war with Russia. And so long as Russia dignifies this illusion and pretends and doesn't call attention to the U.S. involvement in the war because they don't want to piss off Trump, absolutely nothing is going to change. How can you ever establish any trust in a relationship when both people are playing pretend, not accurately interpreting or just acknowledging the situation as it is. So this is why, the war is likely to continue. The latest news is that Witkoff is going to go talk with Vladimir Putin next week, that Jared Kushner might also join him as well. The Russians also have denied that, well, they haven't denied, but they haven't confirmed whether or not Chris Driscoll, the new Army Chief Envoy that is partaking in these talks, has been in talks with any members of any Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi. So let's just get into some of the details of this plan. This is very important stuff. Now, again, I was just having a back and forth with Brian Berletic, and you guys know I'm a big picture, high-level analysis thinker in that I always try to connect the dots. Like I started off with this video, in the fog of war, the best ways to kind of get a bearing on what's really truly happening, or what are the fundamental known knowns, is to step back, go back to first principles thinking, look at the timing of the information. Why all of a sudden is all this information coming out? Why has there been deadlines, right? Because something has changed in the matrix. And what is the broader geopolitical picture that is shaping up? Things are tensing up in the Pacific. Things are tensing up in South America. And the Israelis just ran a live-fire exercise utilizing Stratotankers that simulated another attack on Iran that just happened today. So when taking all of this into account, the price of gold, the rising debt, the U.S. stock market is just teetering on the brink. And that's just, the tip of the iceberg with respect to what's going on. We can surmise that this is likely, very likely, some sort of distraction, which is not intended to really have any material results other than ever so slightly, perhaps moving us towards a potential rapprochement in hostilities. The problem with that arises when you have so many hands in the pot, be it Europe, rogue elements within Ukraine, you have ultra-nationalist hardliners inside Russia who may want to catalyze this conflict a little bit more and do some sort of major provocation in order to fan the flames a little bit more. That's one of the risks that can be at play here. And of course, my punctuated escalation hypothesis that basically speculates that at every kind of period of plateauing of hostilities where there appears to be some kind of stalemate, one of two things can happen. Okay, you can start talking about peace and actually, regressing back down the escalation ladder, or things can escalate and you introduce new weapons, you start overstepping new boundaries or red lines, and we get closer, not further away from nuclear Armageddon. Since Trump was inaugurated, we've only went up the escalation ladder, and much faster than even I could have imagined. I knew it was going to escalate, but I didn't think we'd be here talking about Tomahawk missiles back in September, all right? So anyways, getting back on point here. Here is the original plan points, and then we're going to talk about the revised 19-point plan. So there was an original plan that was consisted of 28 points. So they say. I mean, we really don't even know all the details. There's so much conflicting information, but let's just go on the premise that there was a 28-point plan that was leaked on November 19th. That has since been revised back to 19 points. And of course, remember, this is only a negotiation, as far as we know, between Ukraine and the USA. So we don't even know what sort of level of input Russia has here. They're denying having any input into this whatsoever. On the issue of territorial integrity, the original plan said that Russia needs to retain control of annexed areas and limited Ukrainian withdrawal demands, meaning that they were not going to withdraw from pretty much any of the territory that they currently occupy, the annexed territory. In the revised plan, this is what Ukraine is asking for. And I don't see how Russia agrees to this, but let's see what happens. Ukraine rejects ceding stolen lands including a phased Russian troop pullback from occupied zones with international monitoring. Zelensky called this a key striking point. So if that is true, I can tell you right now, ain't no way in hell that the Russians are ceding probably, maybe they might cede little bits of Kharkov or little bits, in and around the border. Certainly not in the Donbass, okay? The reason why they want that land so bad is because it gives them all the good resources, number one, and, all of the other reasons that they list off, but these are wars for resources, okay? That's really what it fundamentally comes down to, territory and the spoils of war. The second point of contention was ceasefire terms, immediate halt in select areas, but no full demobilization. So that was originally what they had planned. So there'd be, ceasefires in certain parts of the front, but not everywhere. Well, Ukraine altered this in the new 19-point plan and is now demanding expanding it to broader fronts, including a major prison swap, which is doable, and limited fighting pauses, okay? So effectively, no ceasefire. As for security guarantees, the original 28-point plan claimed to include vague US and EU commitments and no NATO path. As I first expressed many days ago in my analysis, the crux of NATO is the Article 5 security guarantee. They've since augmented that to say strengthen multilateral guarantees with the US, EU, and Turkey, and a potential arms embargo lift for Ukraine post-deal, which means that you would see an influx of all kinds of weapon systems, from Tomahawk missiles on down the line. In terms of economic neutrality clauses, Ukraine neutrality, no NATO, that was the original 28-point plan, no NATO, and reparations from frozen Russian assets. In the new plan, they retain neutrality, but they add EU integration incentives, which Russia probably doesn't care about, and reparations tied to an energy deal with Black Sea grain exports. So that's probably feasible. There's a lot of debate on whether they can seize Russian assets and what sort of effect that will have on the EU. I would say that the damage has probably already been done. Withholding it for many years is as bad as stealing it in the modern day with inflation. In terms of the timeline that's expected, the aim is for the end of 2025. That was in the original 28-point plan. And in the new revised 19-point plan, they're targeting finalization by early 2026 with interim steps like demilitarized zones by December. Now, a big sticking point, and this is rumor, but Ukraine initially wanted 600,000 troops, okay, which is a lot of troops. That's about 10 times the amount of troops as we have active duty service members here in Canada. They wanted 800,000, which I should add is about 3 times the amount of troops that they had originally when the war started. This, of course, would not include things like mercenaries, whatever NATO sheep-dip soldiers are fighting, or whatever trainers are on the front lines. It doesn't include other agencies that might not be, a part of the Ukrainian military per se, but may have paramilitary functions, or just, other 3-letter agencies like our FBI equivalent and things of that nature. You have the reserves, of course. There's nothing to stop them from having a, widespread education program on, how to handle military equipment just to get the population primed to be ready for conscription. And if you have 800,000, that's a huge army for a country of maybe the population is 30 million now. Some people say it's as low as 25. For you to sustain one in every, what probably would be, because it wouldn't be one in every 30, it would be one in every 40 people, more or less, and one in every 20 males. It'd be very hard to sustain a functioning economy, which is not wholly dependent on aid from the outside with that. So that's why it seems as though it seems unfeasible, even if they wanted to, that they could have a military that size. But that's what they're wanting. Ultranationalists inside Moscow are saying that they want no more than 100,000 Ukrainian troops. And then you also have to include the Baltic states, Finland, intermarums like Poland and all of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and none of their militaries are capped. So, they can have as big of militaries as they want. They're all on Russia's border, and there's not really much here tangibly about how NATO is going to withdraw some of its forces from those countries, which do pose a potential existential threat to Russia. The cap only applies to peacetime, but it also allows for flexibility for rapid mobilization if needed. So again, 800,000 could quickly become every able-bodied male in a hot minute, considering that at the beginning of this war, they started with 280,000. Starting with 800,000, with military experience now is a pretty big deal. And they're also still wanting this to be paired with commitments like using frozen Russian assets in order to fund this. Okay, so they're asking the Russians to, you provide the funding so that we can sustain an army of 800,000 people and buy the Tomahawk missiles from the United States. I mean, if you are talking about the seizure of Russian assets, if you're talking about the seizure of Russian assets, and Ukraine is going to be trying to sustain a military this large, what you're effectively doing is you're taking Russian funds, and that is what is now funding Ukraine to potentially fight a war in the future. And the Russians have no reason to trust the West. We've seen what happened with the Minsk agreements and how they were violated. And why should we expect that in a situation where nobody is calling a spade, that the outcome would be any different? It's going to be exactly the same, and Russia knows it. Russia, however, has rejected all of these revisions. Okay, so every revision that has been made thus far that Trump says are minor sticking points, all right, have basically been rejected by Russia. And it seems like the maximalist positions of both sides are persisting. And this is going nowhere, with the exception that Jared Kushner might go next week, whatever happens with that. So we'll see. Moscow is criticizing Western megaphone diplomacy, they're calling it, saying that it hasn't received any official peace documents despite days of public talks about a U.S.-led plan. Now, if that's true, that's really insane when you think about it. Okay, if the Russians really genuinely haven't been involved and there was no leaked phone call, and that's just not the Russians trying to cover their asses, because there's a possibility it was, let's be honest. But I'm leaning towards, if the Russians were pioneers on this, and all of these talking points were things that, most of them, I would say about half, are just general things that everybody knows they're going to agree to in the end. So there's always that plausible deniability that, okay, maybe they had a part in this. Maybe this is the basis off which to work off of. But I think that if Russia was actively involved in this thing's creation, I don't think they would have any reason to deny their involvement in it. Okay, again, we must not be bamboozled by the illusion that is trying to be foisted on us. And that is that there is some kind of, back channel buddy-buddy deal between Putin and Trump, and that Trump and Zelensky hate each other. That's all fake. Okay, that's all purely for public consumption. If the United States wanted to extricate itself from this conflict, it could have done so on day one. The fact that they haven't is because they know that removing themselves from that situation would potentially put Russia in a very strong position moving forward. And that, of course, would empower China. That would empower all of their proxies in the region. They cannot release their foot off the boot heel off of Russia's neck inside Ukraine. They must keep the pressure on in some way, shape, or form. And arguably, all the military-industrial complexes around the world, be it the American one, the EU one, or the Russian one, all stand to gain. So Russia has a vested interest in continuing this, knowing full well that they need to prepare for the next major war, which will be fought with Europe, and which will likely be fought amidst the backdrop of emerging artificial intelligence technologies. Now, Kiev claims that it has heavily revised a Trump-drafted peace proposal and that Zelensky wants to travel to the U.S. to make a deal, but he's been advised against doing this, so there isn't another potential PR blowout like we had back earlier in the year. Better to play it safe, even though I think it's largely inconsequential. I mean, look what happened back earlier in the year, and within a few months, Trump was offering Ukraine Tomahawk missiles. So, even if there was, at the end of the day, the prevailing winds dictate which way this is going. Russia, Ukraine, the U.S., and European states remain far apart on core issues related to territory, NATO, security guarantees. The reason why I'm reiterating some of this stuff is I want to make sure, because this is such a muddy situation, and it's important that, we kind of belabor some of these points. Reports say that U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll met Russian officials in Abu Dhabi with a draft worked on in Switzerland, although Russians neither confirm nor deny this, which is kind of a tacit admission, but at the same time, I think they don't want to, they're still playing this game where they don't want to humiliate the U.S., right? They're really playing along, and I think at this point, it'd be in both parties' interest if Russia just said, look, this is between us and the United States, and I think they kind of say that in a backhanded way towards Kiev, but they never blame the United States. And the blame for the war is on both Russia and the United States, but these are the two that are at war. And until they pretend that that's not the reality, I can't see how you foster a relationship of trust if that is the precedent, and that's the starting point. Trump says the plan has been fine-tuned with input from both sides and that only a few remaining points of disagreement remain. Well, if they're as fundamental as territory, as the seizure of assets, as Article 5 guarantees, then that's a pretty serious sticking point, and you're effectively right back where you started. Moscow says it has not been invited to key Western-led talks and hasn't received official documents, so it remains very tight-lipped. Foreign Minister Lavrov has accused the EU and UK of trying to undermine Trump's peace efforts and distort the plan for their own agenda. So Lavrov doesn't at all appear to be bullish about this. In fact, everything that we're hearing and sensing from the Kremlin is that they're not buying this at all. Okay, so what's being lauded as supposedly one of the biggest, progressive leaps towards peace since Trump entered office is actually to the annoyance of the Russians, it seems, because I don't have the clip or the transcript of the speech that Lavrov made today, but it does not look good. Like, it does not look like anything that the West is saying is actually a reality, or at least one that has been run by the Russians. It seems as though they're having a debate amongst themselves as to how they can make Russia look like the bad guy when they reject the deal that they know will be unacceptable to Russian terms. So they're setting it up so that they make it look like this feigning of division between Trump and Zelensky, that, they really tried and they made all of these concessions, all the while not including Russia in the process, so that when they finally bring it to the Russians and Russia rejects it, Trump and, more importantly, his entourage that is involved in all of this stuff, which is, really the key decision makers in this process. Trump just, talks and signs things. He really hasn't had any input, I highly doubt, in any of this. Then, they can say, well, we did everything we could. Now we have to send the Tomahawk missiles or turn them on because, quite frankly, we don't know what's there. There could already be nuclear weapons there for all we know. And that is precisely why the Russians haven't went to the extent of bombing like the parliament buildings in Kiev and things of that nature. So, I think right now we just keep an open mind about what's going on, hope for the best. But again, I'm really getting vibes of what we seen back at the Alaska summit. Look, after that Alaska summit, I knew what time it was, but many people were subdued by the pomp and pageantry of it all, and they thought that was it. Trump said that we're going to make a deal. It was very definitive, and although there wasn't a timeline per se, there was the same kind of optimism that we're going to reach a deal and we're going to reach it real soon, right? And there was almost a sense of certainty that it was a foregone conclusion that the war would be over imminently. And as time goes on, it fizzles out and we come to find that both sides are just trying to buy time. And I would expect that every time this happens, it's going to be even more convincing. It's going to seem as though, okay, this time something really is moving in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it always turns into the same old thing, unfortunately. And the war will be completed when, at this point, if you have the Russians who are winning, why would they want to allow NATO a back door into the country when they're currently winning the conflict? Now, they may have no choice, because NATO may just enter into the war, right? NATO may just openly enter into Ukraine, and then it becomes a Mexican standoff. So it could happen. Maybe both sides are trying to postpone that a little bit more, and Putin probably knows that if he does go too far, ultimately that will be the result. That NATO, Poland in particular, will come to the aid in Ukraine, and quite possibly in a nuclear capacity, and that is when things get very, very sticky. Because when they talk about a war that is limited to the European continent or even a nuclear exchange, that's not going to happen, because obviously one of the biggest and the most important member of NATO is the United States. So unless the United States leaves the alliance altogether, and even if they did, the United States would not stand to benefit one iota from Russia conquering Europe. And it seems unlikely, but consider, if it should happen that the Russians conquered Ukraine, those 600,000 troops, probably many would die, many would leave the country, but probably a few 100,000 would stick around. And then you have the Russians who control Belarus, obviously Russia, and Ukraine. The three biggest, far and away, places where there is still an abundance of all kinds of resources that can, of course, be used to build very, very powerful economies in the future. Europe has nothing but debt. So the Russians don't really stand to benefit by conquering Europe for its resource wealth. There is something to say about, subjugating it for other reasons that could be beneficial, but by and large, it'd be more of a liability. It's almost something you would conquer just so it would stop bothering you. That might be the reason. And while it might seem fantastical that they could ever do that, and that, I've always been of the persuasion that NATO has a lot of capability. It's not that they don't have a lot of capability, it's that it's 32 nations who are all putting their own national interests as priority number one, whereas Russia only has Russia to put as priority. Maybe Belarus is a close second, right? And their new annexed territories, which are effectively treated like Russia. So it's much easier to have a unified front, and where you're able to allocate the best of your resources in the most efficient way that is necessary in order to prosecute a conflict. Whereas if Italy is only, sending its third-rate equipment to the front and they're hoarding the rest for when the Russians come knocking on their door, well, it might be too late at that point. And you could see Russia eventually absorb the Baltics. Eventually, Finland's going to be a more of a challenging situation, I don't doubt. And if they even bother to mess with it at all, that is. But it could be very challenging, but there's other methods of warfare. It's not all about bombs. It's information war. There's color revolutions. There's all sorts of ways that you can undermine other populations to promulgate your own interests. Anyways, that's basically what's going on in the so-called peace talks that we're having with ourselves, apparently. All right. What else do we need to talk about? I think that's about it for today. My voice, I'm still losing my voice. This is the weirdest sickness. I don't know if it's due to when I aspirated the other day, and I just, ever since I've been coughing, or if that aspiration was actually the result of a cold that I was getting, but I don't have any of the usual symptoms. No fever, no nothing like that. So maybe I'm just not drinking enough water. Maybe it's something that simple. Anyways, my friends, until tomorrow, see you then.